Joshua. And we're looking at Joshua chapter 4. And really it's looking at that sense of that legacy of faith. There's something that happens in this chapter that's really important. And it's asking the question, what will your children really remember? And so when you think about that, what are some of your best or your clearest, childhood memories? Think about those for a minute. Your best and your clearest childhood memories. Some of y'all really irritate me because you have, extensive memories of your childhood. You have very clear and sharp, good memory of almost everything that happened. Y'all bug me to death because I don't really have a lot of that. Y'all remember almost everything. You remember conversations. You remember relatives. You remember all the obscure kind of moments, right? Who has a good memory? It has an excellent memory from your childhood. You can remember most things. Anybody? I see a couple of nods. No. See, y'all make me sick. Because, if you're like me in any way, I have, kind of flashes of memory, of images of things, places, maybe, nothing that's extensive or very specific. And in fact, some of y'all have very good recall of all of those things, and that makes it even worse. I have to have some sort of trigger of some kind to remember certain things. Someone will say something, you'll see something specific or a reminder, a picture or something, and you can kind of recall some of the circumstances of those moments. But recall is difficult for me, but some of y'all remember all those things very well. So in that sense, there's parts of my life that I can barely remember. And there are certain parts that I can't tell, my kids about things in my life that I have a hard time remembering. So you probably won't find me writing an autobiography someday. Not without a lot of help from other people. Then it's kind of not an autobiography so much anymore. But then that also leaves all this kind of room for embellishment. I can just, I don't remember, so I can just make all sorts of stuff up, right? Isn't that how it works? Yep. No, not really. So the hard part is I can't really pass on, some of my memory of those important things that have happened to me very well. So my memory it's frustrating. I know it bugs my wife too, because I can't remember a lot of things. I can't remember what she tells me when she says, go to the store and get this, and I call her like 3 or 4 times and say, what? What was I supposed to get again? Anybody else like that? No. Okay, there's more hands that go up for that one. I just kind of wish that I could, download it and have it on file where I can have everything perfectly stored and memory, but it's not like that. But we are essentially, in a lot of ways, we are living out what Solomon talked about in Ecclesiastes. So he says, there is no remembrance for former things, and things yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. Right? Memory is hard to pass on from one generation to the next. Understanding, learning, all those things, we are the products of information and things that have been passed on. But, so how many of us can tell how something was invented? We by this point, with so many things that are invented, computers and speakers and all these other types of things, we know how to use them, but we don't really know how they were made. We certainly, most of the time, don't know how to fix them. That's why we've become kind of a throwaway culture. As soon as something breaks, we throw it away and replace it with the new one. So there's a lot of things that we don't remember, even though we have a lot of information. And stuff like this is why, there's an increasing number of people that even will dispute and say things like the Holocaust never happened. Right? Because fewer people are alive who were actually there to witness it. And so it's sad to think that in another couple of generations or so, the whole thing might be thought of as a fairy tale or a legend rather than history. And they might try to put it alongside something like George Washington and the cherry tree. with something as terrible as that, because those things will not be remembered by those who follow. So think about what people are going to do. Think about this. Here we are in the middle of 2020, and it's been an unusual year to say the least, right? It's been kind of different than other years. What are some of the things that people are going to try to do to remember 2020? How many pictures are going to feature people standing around with all the masks and all that kind of stuff? And generations in the future, I hope next year people are going to be able to look at us and say, man, they were stupid. That would be nice, wouldn't it, when nobody was having to worry about this stuff anymore? But, our poor memory, you think about how much it can drive my wife nuts or other people nuts about having a good recall and such. Imagine how much that's got to drive God nuts, that we can't remember simple things. He goes to such trouble to do things. He goes to such trouble to tell us things, to do even great and big things, miracles. He'll save millions of people. He'll part the seas. He'll give his Torah. He'll basically give them breakfast delivered almost every morning for 40 years. And yet the memory of those events can't be passed on directly to the next generation. There is no genetic memory, there's no download, there's no video footage of all those things. Everything that's transpired in the life of the Israelites that God has done could be lost. Could have been lost within a generation if they didn't figure out a way to pass on their experiences and their faith to those future generations. So that's part of the power of the written word, is that it's able to transmit things that have happened in the past to those future generations. But even that has its flaws, because what becomes the problem? Well, they just wrote down a story. That's not what really happened, right? That's where some people go. But that's one of the reasons why, God does, or he says, or he commands for the Israelites, the people of God, to do something to help them to remember the things that he has done, because it can be lost so quickly. And one of the most important ones comes with the commandment about the Shabbat. When you look at that back in Exodus 20, he says, remember Yom Shabbat, and to keep it holy. When you look at that word, remember, is zakar. It means to mark so as to be recognized. To mark it so that you'll remember what it is, to make it to be remembered, right? So we do that sometimes when we have people over at our house, right? At least I try to get you to do this. We have our party cups that we have, and you'll want to fill up your drink, to eating dinner, and I usually put a pin right next to it. What do I want you to do with that? I want you to mark it somehow or another so that we'll know that's your cup, and so that geniuses like me won't come along and just pick up a random cup and start drinking out of somebody else's. Or somebody else won't drink out of mine, because I don't want your saliva in my cup. Right? So we mark these things so you'll remember whose is whose. So it's very important that we do that. We mark it so it's to be recognized, to make it to be remembered. And so this word zakar means to remember or recall, to mention or record, as in terms of writing, to cause to remember or remind. It's used 240 times in the course of the Tanakh. And it's an important concept, the idea of remembering. And it was first used in Genesis chapter 6 when God was talking about remembering Noah. So we've got to remember, we must remember the Sabbath. Because in reality, it's actually very easy to forget it. You can wake up in the morning and go about your lives and not notice that it's the Sabbath, can't you? I mean, does nothing about that day looks any different than any other? Are the stars still, in the sky overnight? Yeah, it's the same stars. They're doing exactly the same thing. They're moving the same way overhead. When the sun comes up, is it going in the same direction? Does it come up in essentially the same place? The sun's the same color, isn't it? It's not like it flashes for us when it's Shabbat. It's not like it turns green or something on Shabbat. I mean, that would be one way to set things apart. Everybody would know, if the sun was blinking every 7 days, the earth rotates the same direction, gravity works the same way. What if on Shabbat only, every 7 days, the manna didn't show up on the seventh day, right? So imagine if on Shabbat, the gravity was lessened and we could all, jump around like people on the moon or fly. Would people know whether it was Shabbat or not? Yeah, they would know. If God did something like that, there would be no question. Nobody could miss it. But He doesn't. He doesn't make the Shabbat that obvious. And it says something about us as His people, because it's not as if He's going to forget that it's Shabbat. It's us who are likely to forget that it's Shabbat. It takes effort and purpose to remember, to mark it so that it's recognized, to make it where it's remembered. And it doesn't exactly say, the Scripture doesn't really say exactly how to do that. Beyond things like do no work or don't make the fire, those types of things. But that command to mark so as it's recognized, that's actually the basis for some of the things that you and we may do as part of our family. Some of y'all may light a candle on Shabbat. Some of y'all may blow the shofar on Shabbat. Some of y'all may turn the TV off. Some of y'all may bless your children, right? Anybody else do those types of things? Am I leaving anything out that somebody does? Something that marks it, something that sets it apart and makes it different from the other days. And if you don't do something like that, otherwise the Sabbath will come and go and you won't even notice it's passing. And in fact, most people don't. In my past as a kid, you know how I marked Saturday coming along? It was cartoon day. I would wake up. I hated waking up in the morning to go to school, but I loved waking up on Saturday to get up early to watch cartoons. How does that work? Growing up, that shifted to college football and all the other types of things. But, rest and time with God, that's not what sets this day apart for most of us. We have to put effort into that. But so this is, with the Sabbath, that's one of those things that He calls us and commands us to remember. Other moments need remembering. Other instances of the move of God need something so that a legacy of faith can be passed on to those future generations, can be remembered. And of all the things, I want my children to remember from their childhood, I want them most of all to remember the things of God. The move of God in our lives, the things that we have learned, what He has taught us, and all the fun stuff that we may do, all the great places that we may go, those are fine, but if they forget about God, then what good is that? I remember the fun places. I remember the people, the friends, the toys, the cartoons, a day like today, where the candy is overwhelming, where the favorite costumes or whatever that I used to wear as a kid. But are those things what God wants me to look back on? Are those the things that are really important for us as His people? When you think about it, what moments or moves of God have I forgotten about from my childhood? Because I'm pretty confident and I'm pretty sure He was moving. in my life, in my family, and different things like that, but I don't remember like I should. You know, from my adult life even, because I didn't mark the moment in some way to remember. You know, what are we witnessing in our day? What are we witnessing this year? What are we witnessing in the next few days and weeks? You know, it's possible that we are going to be witnessing the death of a nation by its own hand in the next few weeks. It's also possible that we've been witnessing God move among his people in powerful ways. That some of his people are answering the call to his Messiah, while others are answering his call to the Torah. And for so many, those things are moving and happening and moving right on by and not even noticing. Most of the believing community doesn't recognize that. And which one is the world going to memorialize the most? The elections, the potential fall of a nation, or the move of God among his people? Which one should the people of God remember? You know, God, he didn't want the Israelites to let a big moment like the crossing over of the Jordan to be forgotten either. So when we look at this in Joshua chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "Now when all the nation had finished crossing over the Jordan, Adonai spoke to Joshua, saying, Take for yourself 12 men from the people, one man from each tribe, and command them, saying, Take for yourselves 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the feet of the Kohanim are standing firm, and carry them over with you, and deposit them at the place where you will lodge tonight." You know, I've always thought that was kind of a strange statement. I mean, can you imagine being one of the priests that are standing there in the middle of the Jordan? You know, they're waiting on 2 to 3 million people to cross, so they might have had to hold the ark up in shifts and trade it off or something, because they probably have to stand there for quite some time to get everybody across, even though they did kind of hurry through it. But can you imagine what it would be like? You're waiting for everybody to get across, and then some of the men, somebody from each tribe comes and starts digging in the riverbed while you're still standing there. And they dig up the rocks and things that are close to you and start hauling them off. I'm sitting there thinking, okay, guys, leave us a trail so at least we can walk out. Right? Don't take everything where we don't have a place to step on, because I certainly don't want to drop what we're holding. But I mean, it's just odd to think what that experience would be for them personally, to stand there while everybody else is walking past and doing different things. Carry them over to the place where you will lodge. It says, "Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from Bnei Israel, one man from each tribe, and Joshua said to them, Cross over before the ark of Adonai your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift up a stone on his shoulder for the number of the tribes of Bnei Israel. Let this be a sign among you. When your children ask later, saying, What do these stones mean to you? Then you will say to them, Because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of Adonai. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones will be a reminder. They will be a memorial to Bnei Israel forever." So if you remember, the word that was there for remember when it talks about Shabbat was zakar. This one's a closely related word. It's zakron, which means a memento or a memorial, memorable thing. A memorial or a record, a reminder or a remembrance. And it's used 25 times. And the first time that it's talked about. The first time it is used is Exodus 12:14, where he says, this day is to be a zikron for you, a memorial for you. What day is he talking about here? In Exodus chapter 12, he's talking about which day? He's talking about Passover. He's talking about the night that they were brought out of Egypt. And so here they are crossing over the Jordan. They're having this powerful, powerful moment. Something that is memorable, something that this generation had not seen, because almost everybody who crossed the Red Sea, they died. But they're having their own moment, and already right off the bat, God is anticipating them having a hard time remembering what happened. He's having a hard time, or he's anticipating that they're going to have a hard time passing on that experience to their children. So he knows that they need more than that strength, that chazak. He knows that they need even more than courage as they are crossing over the Jordan. They also need a good memory. And so they take these stones from the middle of the riverbed, and these really could not have been very small stones, because at least the way this translation puts it, says that they were to lift them up onto their shoulders and carry them out. Right? Now, if it was a stone like that, would they have to lift it up on their shoulders and carry it? That looked kind of awkward, wouldn't it? I mean, I remember those pictures of y'all remember the boom boxes from the 80s, right? Where, you were, the bigger man you were, it was the size of the box that you were carrying on your shoulder, the bigger speakers, the louder. Can you see some guy walking out with a real little one like right here? Like one of those little Bluetooth button things? No. They're not going to do that. They're going to try to get a larger one, and if the guy next to me got one this size, then I'm going to make sure I find one smaller or bigger. And this is men we're talking about here. All right, if he gets one this big, then the next guy's going to get one this big, and it's just going to keep going from there. I'd hate to be the last guy to get one. I'll tell you that much. Because he's probably going to have a small Volkswagen or something. But, so here they are, they're carrying these things out. And so one man is essentially carrying each. And they took them up to the place that they camped, a place called Gilgal, which means a circle of standing stones or something that has been rolled together. And when you see this, it's just north. They're crossing the Jordan over here. Is about, they say it's within a mile or so northeast of Jericho. So they're not very far from what becomes essentially their first target. And that's the camp that they have. Gilgal was this base of operations from which they did all of their work or their conquest of the promised land for the next, I think it's about 5 or 6 years, as they were conquering the promised land. And so it's, they go from Gilgal down to Jericho, but they come back. Ai is right over here. And so the different campaigns are going on, but they're always coming back to Gilgal. This is where, in Gilgal, is where the first Passover in the land was celebrated. It's a place where the manna actually stopped because they ate the fruit of the land for the first time. So after each engagement, after each campaign, they would come back to Gilgal. This is what I thought was odd about all of this. They didn't seem to move into Jericho. They didn't seem to move into Ai or these other places. They didn't live on the battlefield. They went into battle, but they always had a home, essentially, to go to. They didn't live there yet. And so after each engagement, they would come back to Gilgal, and they would come back to the place that had these standing stones. They would come back to the place where they would remember. They would see those stones. They would be reminded that everything started for them We can't forget that this is where we came from. We were over here on the eastern side, and the Lord has brought us to this side. And we're not going back. We're not going back to where we were in that sense. And later Gilgal became a religious center. It also even became a place for false worship in Israel. In Hosea, chapter 12, he says, even Adonai Elohei Tzavot. Adonai is his memorial name. This is the name to be remembered. So you should return to your God. Keep covenant loyalty and justice and wait for your God continually. Okay, that's verses 6 and 7. They may go off to the battlefield. They may go off in other directions, but where do they need to always come back to? They need to come back to Him. They need to remember their covenant. They need to remember His justice. They need to wait for Him, because what happens in verse 10, he says, Yet I have been Adonai your God since the land of Egypt. I will yet again make you dwell in tents as in the days of the Moed. What feast is that? What Moed is that? Where they're dwelling in tents. Look, you're going to be on the move. Right? I also spoke through the prophets, and I multiplied visions. Now through the prophets I will make parables. Since Gilead is full of iniquity, they are utterly worthless. And in Gilgal, this is that place, they sacrifice bulls. Now, by the time of Hosea, are they supposed to sacrifice anywhere else but Jerusalem? No. So even their altars will become heaps of rocks along the furrows of my field. See, God is always to be remembered as the Lord God of hosts, the heaven's armies. And if they really want to experience victory over their enemies, they need to understand Him in these terms. And come back under the covenant that they agreed to when they crossed over the Jordan. But they had forgotten. The witness of those standing stones was not remembered or kept. Which is why I think that this statement, I believe this statement about this heaps of rocks, if all the rocks are in a heap, then what are they not doing? They're not standing. They're not serving as a memorial. They're not helping them remember. All that stuff has been torn down. And they had built these altars, and their altars will become heaps of rocks and such. But the only reason why those altars and things would have been there is because they would have forgotten the testimony of the standing stones that were there in the first place. They had forgotten that they had crossed over, just like much of our world has forgotten how Noah had crossed over from the previous world to the new world after the flood. That there are moments where God does something significant, and it needs to be remembered, because life is never the same. Abraham answered the call, and he left his family, his father's house, the land that he knew, and he went to the land that God would show him. The Israelites came out of Egypt. They were receiving the promise. Here with Joshua, Messiah comes. All of these things are moments that change everything. And they need to be remembered. They cannot be forgotten, because we're living in a world that is forgetting more and more of the Word of God. They're forgetting more and more of the things of God. And they're so much so that they're not even able to recognize and see it when He's actually moving and working. And so we need to have our eyes restored to see His hand at work. What have we forgotten even as a nation that would put us in our current situation? Essentially, we have forgotten the truth that's been stated from the beginning, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Not everybody in our country believes that anymore. You know, we have forgotten many of the founding principles of freedom and liberty. You know, many appeals for this nation to be in covenant with God, and the many appeals to seek his blessing. Oh, no, that stuff never happened. They weren't really believers in God at all. We're forgetting as a people, as a nation. And if you lose that foundation, you're going to lose a lot. We've forgotten even the idea of civil discourse. We've forgotten what actual, in just a couple of generations ago, we've forgotten what actual fascism looks like and what communism does to nations and peoples. We're in trouble when our nation forgets that kind of stuff. Many have even forgotten that no politician is going to be our savior, but that the Lord raises up kings and nations, and he's also the one that tears them down. And our nation needs a reminder of those things. And if the Lord reminds us, then our altars might end up the same way as those did. And what have we forgotten as the people of God? In a lot of ways, we have forgotten the ways of our fathers. Many have forgotten, his Torah, his Sabbath, his feast. We've had those purged by design from our faith and from our practice. So much so that we think they're weird. When we got started in all of this, and we were living and beginning to look at his Torah and try to understand the calendar, his feast, man, those things were odd. Those don't make sense to me at all. I'm still learning on those things. But we don't understand them the way we should, and they were something that was always supposed to be a part of our lives. We've forgotten that it's the enemy who does not want us to obey God. God doesn't want us to not obey God. Yeshua doesn't want us to not obey God. It's the enemy who doesn't want us to obey God. And so in that, we've also forgotten the goal. We've forgotten where Messiah Yeshua is taking us in the kingdom. So we as a nation, we need a reminder. We as the people of God, we need a reminder. And we've also forgotten, as individuals and families. We've forgotten, the one who bought us. We've forgotten that we've been rescued from the dominion of darkness and delivered into the kingdom of the Son. In many ways, we've forgotten that call to holiness, that call to walk a narrow path. We've forgotten what we have crossed over to. Forgotten what covenant we have agreed to become a part of. So many of us have forgotten, our new creation identity in Messiah, our new citizenship in the kingdom, our new adopted family. And so we need reminders. Our children need reminders of just how far we have come in our walk of faith. God has taken Vicki and I in a direction that we could not have anticipated and expected. And it's been, 10 plus years. And we've tried to pass that on to our kids. It would be really disappointing if our kids didn't continue to live this way. We need to be willing to pass those types of things on. We need reminders. Our children need reminders of just how far we've come and where he has taken us. We never want to forget how the Lord has spoken to us. We never want to forget how he has taught us, how he has changed us. And so we need to be on the lookout for memorials, for milestones, for something tangible that we can point to show who we are and what defines our lives. All of those things that the V'ahavta talks about. Talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Binding them as a sign on your hand and on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house. Right? Is that a memorial? Is the mezuzah a memorial? Yes. It's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a reminder of those things. We need something even tangible to set apart, like the Shabbat. Like the shofar, like the feasts. We're in good company when we say we need a reminder. But if we stop doing these things, if we stop with these reminders, then our lives would go back to what it was before. We're in good company in needing a reminder. God anticipates us needing a reminder. And so I just encourage all of you to look back on your life, on how God has taken you, how He has moved you, and look for those ways of establishing and marking a memorial of some kind to say, this is where the change happened. This is where something important happened, so that you can look back on it and say, I remember this. In Joshua 4:18, again, this is kind of repeating the same thing. It says, as soon as the Kohanim who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of Adonai came up from the middle of the Jordan, and the soles of the feet of the Kohanim were drawn up to the dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. Now, I suspect that those priests that were carrying the ark are not going to forget this moment. It's everybody else that's going to have a hard time with that. It's their kids that are going to have a hard time. Dad, did that really happen? Sure, son, it sure did. Are they going to remember? So now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. 10th day of the first month. And what happens on the 10th day of the first month? What's that?
The lamb brought into the home.
The lamb is brought into the home for Passover. That's one way of marking things, isn't it? They can say exactly what day it was. Oh yeah, that was the day that the lamb was brought in to the home. That was the day that Yeshua rode into Jerusalem. What we typically call the triumphal entry. But we've forgotten that it was the 10th day of the first month. He says, those 12 stones which they had taken out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. Then he said to Bnei Israel, saying, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you will inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. And what do you think the kids would do when they said that? If they were standing there looking at those stones that were supposed to be standing as this memorial, they would look at those stones, and they would turn and they'd probably look back at the river. And they'd look over there and they're like, no. How could they do that? But we're here. We're on this side. We're not on that side. That's what these things were to do. And this is a very similar question to like what happens on what feast day? It's very similar to the Passover Seder, isn't it? When the children ask the questions, what is it? Why do we, on this night, why do we sit? Why do we recline and not stand? Or why do we do this? These are all memorials built in to the life of faith for the people of God to remember the great things that He has done. What are these stones? God, what did God do in the past? What does this thing mean? Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For Adonai your God dried up the waters of Jordan before you until you crossed, just as Adonai your God did to the Sea of Reeds, which He dried up before us until we crossed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know Adonai's hand is mighty, and so that you may fear Adonai your God forever. The enemy doesn't want us to remember that. He doesn't want us to remember the things that he has done. That's why they don't really know exactly where this altar or where this memorial standing stones are. They think they know. But because people have forgotten, that's why it's not maintained. Wouldn't it be nice to have something like that? And some people speculate and say, hey, do we have something like that at the Red Sea where they crossed? It'd be nice to be able to say, no, we know that this happened because, look, it's right there. There's the evidence. But you and I, we need, a memorial. Our nation needs a memorial. The people of God need a memorial. We need to pray that we remember who we are. We need his memorials for that. We need to pray that we remember who he has called us to be. We need a memorial for who we are. And this way of life is the sign for us. We need to pray that we remember all that he has done for us. We need to pray that we remember where he is taking us and how we will live. Because if we would truly remember who we are called to be, if we will truly remember who we are, that's the kind of things that will change the world. That's the kind of things that will change our nation, our community, but especially our families. So that we hold on to who we are and who he has called us to be. And that's the way that we'll be able to leave a legacy of faith for our children and future generations, because it's also about their kids and what they pass on and what they see God do.